Rafael, Isabel, thank you both for joining us this week. Let's look at the latest really big development in a way, which was Boris Johnson looking as though he was increasing the chances of no deal in that Sun hustings on Monday. Is that what you came away thinking had happened, or Isabel, do any of those words just mean nothing?
No, I mean, I think the chances of a no deal have really increased since both Boris Johnson and Jeremy Hunt actually said the backstop was dead, and Johnson rejected a time limit or a unilateral exit from the backstop, which are the two sort of positions that could be agreed with the European Union. So he's essentially saying that he doesn't want anything that the European Union is at all amenable to, at which point you start to think, well, if no one's going to agree, then we're heading towards an exit without an agreement, which is something that he said he's not afraid of anyway, but he would like to avoid if possible. We're starting to see what his possibles really are now.
It was puzzling, the timing, wasn't it?
Yeah, the slightly mysterious thing about it is it was something he didn't need to do. So he's already sort of locked down the support of those people who would gladly walk away from the EU without the deal. He's trying to keep on side sort of a group of Tory MPs, at least drawn from the opposite wing of the party, who really are at least hoping that there's some more moderate, liberal, sort of old Boris Johnson from his Mayor of London days character who will suddenly emerge and say, oh, actually, I was just sort of gaming the hardliners. Really, I'm a perfectly reasonable, rational human being that you would like me to be. And he's won, essentially. No one thinks Jeremy Hunt is going to be the next leader of the Conservative Party and Prime Minister. So why do something that, as Isabel described, very clearly closes down one of the avenues you might have? I mean, the one sort of deal scenario that everyone could try and construct in their heads was enough MPs are desperate. He could, it's what's sometimes called the sort of lipstick on a pig strategy. You just get the old deal, you do something cosmetic to it. You say, oh, it's Boris's brilliant new deal. And then with a few desperate Labour MPs who really don't want the second referendum and exhausted Tory MPs, you just flop over the line with kind of 321 MPs. He's now just made that way harder, or at least a signal that it'd be way harder. And I'm genuinely surprised trying to calculate why throw away one, why block off one of the avenues that you had, even if it was a very narrow one.
Do you have a working theory what he was up to?
Well, I mean, he is much more deliberate than he ever lets on. And so what appears to be something just sort of slipping out casually is normally very calculated. What I found actually more surprising was the fact that he ruled out an election before 2022, saying that was absolutely not going to happen. Now, you might say, well, we've been here before. Look who promised there wasn't going to be an early election, and look who ended up calling one Theresa May. But I thought that was an interesting thing for him to do, given it may actually be quite useful for him to call one.
In a way, I find that one easier, because there's always going to be a situation where you can say, I didn't want this election, but these awful people have forced it on me. These awful Romani Labour people, these wicked Europeans, that's, in a way, that's
absolutely.
a sort of...
That's the thing that I found
Yeah, that might
odd.
be a sort of verbal tick in a way. Yeah. But no, I agree. It's interesting because that's one of the available things he might want to do. I mean, it does occur to me that on the no deal thing, if he genuinely believes in the sort of game theory strategy that, what's sometimes called the sort of psycho strategy, where you absolutely have to demonstrate that you really are prepared to do the extreme thing. You cannot even leave room for people to think it's a bluff. Even if it is, part of the problem with the sort of no deal bluff discussion, constructing it in those terms, is once you say it's a bluff, then it doesn't work anymore. So maybe he is actually sort of tactically thinking, whatever happens, when I go and meet Mrs. Merkel or Monsieur Macron and say to them, we've got to come up with some new arrangement, they at least have to understand quite how serious I am. And then whatever concession they give, I'm in a better position to say, oh, look, they blinked, they caved, I've won. But again, we might be overanalyzing someone who is not famously consistent or rational in everything he does.
Isabel, you said something there about that he does these things deliberately. And that's not a universal opinion, is it? Because some people think he just says stuff to amuse the people in front of him, or because it comes into his head. That would suggest you think that there is a plan, that this is maybe doing the psycho strategy or whatever we want to call it.
I mean, I wouldn't say a sort of grand plan where he's got a whole map with flags on it or anything like that, but he is someone who's very much in command of their own language, and as you say, he says things to amuse whoever's in the room, but he does say them very much deliberately. He's not like Andy Burnham, who sort of just says whatever someone has said before him, basically, and then goes into the next room and says something completely different. He has a consistency to him.
Yeah, he's scripted. Famously, that people would say before he went on camera, if his hair was too straight, he'd do the kind of tousling of the hair.
You can see it on camera quite often, just before he comes in the room.
To look as if it's somehow sort of spontaneous. And it's a very constructed, calculated... Yeah, exactly.
So does that make you think there is a plan? Because this comes to one of the other hearts of the issues. We're all, journalists have been going around trying to work out where's the plan, where's the central figure, where's the guiding intelligence, where are the work streams and the rest of it. Do you feel you've got a sense of that, Isabel?
No, I think that would probably be too high a compliment to pay. I don't think his campaign team have shown yet a masterful grasp of detail on Brexit or actually on domestic policy, and their fallback whenever they're asked something that they don't know about is to say, we don't want to be so presumptuous as to start measuring up the curtains. Well, actually, in a leadership contest, you do need to be presumptuous enough to say what you're going to do as leader, and they've often dodged questions on a number of policy things. But I think what Rafael was saying in terms of getting European leaders to blink is quite important, because we saw yesterday Sarah Champion, who's a Labour MP, who said that she would rather have no deal than no Brexit. And then when she was questioned a bit further about that, she said, well, it's a game of poker, which firstly, you don't tend in a game of poker. I mean, I'm not very good at cards, but you don't tend in a game of poker to say, this is the moment where I'm bluffing, guys, as you pretend you've got a really good hand. Yet that's her strategy, whereas Boris Johnson is at least pursuing a more serious bluff.
Yeah, the fallacy of that is that because we've had 2 years of the Article 50 negotiations, all the cards are on the table. So, it is at least, in terms of actually the balance of power, what happens in the event of a no-deal scenario, it's pretty clear now, who sort of suffers more from that point of view. But it's still, there is sufficient will on the European side to avoid a no-deal scenario that I suppose there certainly was capacity, probably slightly reluctantly from the European side, to give a new Prime Minister something. But then again, we come back to where we started. That something is the one thing that he's basically ruled out.
So someone was talking the other day about the sort of change the font size approach, lipstick on the pig. Can I pin you down on whether you think that is something that Boris Johnson would seriously consider doing, putting all this rhetoric of the campaign to one side and actually looking for something that is way, way short of anything he said in the campaign and is much, much closer to Theresa May? What percentage chance, having observed him these weeks, do you think there is that he will do that?
I mean, I think it would be very tempting for him, because he just wants to get Brexit done and not be the next person to be blamed for an even greater mess. But I'm just not sure you can get that past, even as a better salesman, as someone who sort of speaks Brexit like he does. I don't think you can get that past the European Research Group. They have throughout this contest been so obsessed with purity that they've only agreed to see certain candidates in the early stages. It was only Boris Johnson and Dominic Raab who even got before the senior members
granted an audience.
Exactly, of the ERG. And so for them to suddenly say, we're just dazzled by your blonde hair and we're going to agree to all the things we've been incredibly angry about for the past year, I think is slightly improbable.
Yeah.
That's not to say that Boris Johnson might hope that they would be dazzled by him, because he does have that tendency.
The calculation would have to be there were some Labour MPs to bail him out and compensate. Where are we on that?
Well, the problem with that is it's the sort of Rubik's Cube problem that when you line up one side, you then mess up all the colours on the other. So if he gets a few reds on that side, he's suddenly lost a bunch of blues, and the other way around. And those Labour MPs, so the Sarah Champion thing was quite interesting. There's the sort of Lisa Nandy, Gloria De Piero. There's a group of people who really have more or less come to the conclusion now that any deal is better than no deal, and really don't want a referendum. These are Labour people, just want to stick a bow on it, call it Brexit, move on. It's just politically, within the culture of the Labour Party, very, very difficult to be the person who throws a lifeline to a Tory Prime Minister. Any Tory Prime Minister. They weren't prepared to do it for Theresa May. They're really going to be even less likely to do it for someone like Boris Johnson, who is increasingly perceived on the left and the progressive side of British politics as this kind of horrible British Trump iteration. So culturally, it's really hard for them to be the people that bailed him out.
The one caveat that people put to that is that, well, it looks like the chances, if it looked like the chances of Brexit were receding because Parliament was saying no to no deal and all the rest of it, and Labour's position was about to firm up as a Remain party, if you were a Northern Labour MP, say from a strongly Brexity constituency, you might feel now is the moment you have to do the thing you've been putting off.
I think one way that perhaps works, that there is still a feeling that at the very, very top of the Labour Party, so Jeremy Corbyn himself and some of the people around him, their preference is still to have Brexit, because ultimately the radical left-wing political economic programme they want really involves not being bound by state aid rules, not being bound by European competition law and various things. So you can sort of imagine a scenario where, with a sort of a nod and a wink and a bit of a nudge, permission is given to some Labour MPs to help this blessed thing get over the line, as long as Jeremy's fingerprints aren't on it. Now, I don't know how exactly you arrange that, but that's a dynamic there where they were sort of protected from the wrath of the Labour side for having somehow enabled Boris Johnson. Could they be given permission to do that?
I think you then have a sort of out of the frying pan and into the fire situation where, yes, you've sorted Brexit, you've moved on, but there's something so visceral about the way so much of the Labour Party responds to Boris Johnson and the SNP as well. As soon as his name is raised in the chamber, the temperature goes up by quite a few degrees. And for the Tory party, when Theresa May went into talks with Jeremy Corbyn, that was really the end of Theresa May, because they viscerally hate Jeremy Corbyn. They think he associates with anti-Semites, they think that he would destroy the economy and so on. And so that was Theresa May's that was her basically signing her own death warrant. And it could be the same for the Labour Party. Even if you don't have Jeremy Corbyn even giving nudges and winks to working with Boris Johnson, if you start to have a group of MPs who are prepared to work with him, you can see the internal splits and the internal anger between colleagues actually getting much worse in the long term after Brexit. And there's this question for both the parties of how they can hang together. We've talked mostly about the Tories, but actually Labour is in a very precarious position on that.
And this is the classic problem, and it's a sort of fallacy we often just slip into, which is thinking the issue is getting 320 votes for a deal in one vote, one night, on a certain date before the 31st of October. But you've got to do all the enabling legislation. So it's not just assembling a coalition for the deal, it's assembling the coalition for a whole range of primary legislation. So, if Lisa Nandy or Gareth Snell, whoever it is, goes, oh, go on then, have your deal, that's one thing. They're not going to still be walking through the same lobby as Boris Johnson and Steve Baker every day for the following 2 or 3 weeks. That's much harder to envisage. Yeah. So I think it's, as soon as you start to actually war game the moment after the big meaningful vote, you realise it just becomes, it's still, with this parliament, with the arithmetic as it is, it's so hard.
I wanted to come to Labour in a second, but just before we leave what Boris Johnson will actually do, what percentage chance, I notice everybody, including me, is fighting shy of putting any numbers on it, but what percentage chance do you give the idea that Boris Johnson, what that was about in the Sun debate, was Boris Johnson actually in his mind already made up, has decided that no deal is where he's probably heading, and it's all about getting the optics right on the way there? Because as someone put it to me the other day, it looked originally as though he was asking for a unicorn, and now he's asking Europe for a Fabergé unicorn. He knows he's asking for something he can't get. His mind is made up. What do you think of that idea?
Yeah, I think we're probably about 70% there on that, actually.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of connected to the thing you were saying before about what, if there was some sort of deal, what would he want? Everyone's sort of fixated on the backstop, but the backstop exists for a reason, which is that if you take the UK out of the single market and the customs union, you need a border. It's very hard to put a border, certainly on the island of Ireland, without really doing a lot of damage to the Good Friday Agreement. Now, what Theresa May had sort of decided was, well, we don't really deep down want to have such great regulatory divergence that really becomes necessary. So ultimately, she would have lived with a customs union, or you have full alignment. Now, what Boris Johnson doesn't believe in a lot, but I think with regard to Brexit, he does really buy that sort of buccaneering Atlanticist breakaway. Europe is the sort of dead hand of regulation. This sort of sclerotic continental model doesn't suit our sort of free trading, sort of lusty Western, whatever it is, Anglo-Saxon, he would express it better, vision. But the bottom line here, that means a border, right? So the reason he doesn't want the backstop isn't because he doesn't like the backstop, it's because he actually, whether you put it in the Irish Sea, which means he's got to get rid of the DUP, or you put it between the North and the Republic, which does violence to the Good Friday Agreement, the Brexit model, whatever Brexit model he wants, involves a border. And yeah, that does sort of suggest, that points towards saying, and the way you get that is to make it a fait accompli by leaving on the 31st without a proper agreement.
I said we'd come to Labour. Where do you think Labour's journey on Brexit policy is going to end? Will it actually be transformed by the coming party conference, moving it into being the party of Remain in all circumstances? Or is that actually probably not going to happen now on balance? The forces aren't there to make that happen. And is history potentially, if we end up with no deal somehow by October the 31st, is going to race past on the outside lane anyway and make that all redundant?
No, yes, the party conference isn't until the end of September anyway, so it's going to be quite late for them to be changing policy at that stage. There will be a very serious attempt from backbenchers, particularly led by Shadow Cabinet member, Deputy Leader Tom Watson, and a few other Shadow Cabinet members, I think. But in terms of the impact that might have, it's quite late to be switching around. And I think damage in terms of its electoral prospects have probably already been done.
Yeah, we're sort of already in a situation where the Labour people who are very Remain are saying, well, we are a Remain party, and the people who are saying, no, we're not. I think, again, there's a sort of a misconception that's gone on here, which is very typical of the Labour Party, which is all likes having meetings and rules and deciding things by the correct process, when actually everything is then decided in the sort of meeting before the meeting and all stitched up somewhere else. Yeah, the crucial difference is between a technical policy that Jeremy Corbyn can sign up to and a cause for which Jeremy Corbyn campaigns. And we know that stylistically those are totally different things. You know, this is a man who's quick on the draw with a megaphone when it's something he cares about. So you could easily get to a situation where, yes, the Labour Party in sort of pigeon steps has found itself being the party of a referendum and notionally therefore Remain being on the ballot. But getting to the point where Jeremy Corbyn is back in a spirit of 2015 and 2016 there, you know, saying, is it right that this awful Brexit is happening? We demand a rematch, you know, doing it with full, you know, Corbynism turned up to 11. No, it's really, really hard to see because that is not what he believes and that isn't who he is.
You're nodding, Isabel.
Yeah, and also the role of his advisors, Seamus Milne and Carrie Murphy, and the people around them.
Yeah, you have to look at what Len McCluskey says about this.
Yeah.
And you know, and ultimately, for you know, whatever else Len McCluskey has at Unite, he has the checkbook for the campaign fund, and he is, you know, ideologically Eurosceptic on this issue.
And one of the reasons that John McDonnell and Diane Abbott and others have been calling on Corbyn to at least sideline Murphy and Milne is that they are, particularly Milne, a real obstacle to becoming more of a Remain party, and anything to do with a second referendum, for instance, is something that Milne is very bitterly opposed to. And the argument within the Labour Party is that Jeremy Corbyn does what his advisors tell him to. Now, Corbyn's allies push back against that, but certainly that those two advisors are a very strong influence on him, and they're people who others find quite difficult to work with.
Yeah, you certainly get the impression, certainly, you know, although the sort of the ultimate decisions are Jeremy's, so it's not that he sort of isn't making the choices. It's just that particularly on the EU thing. I mean, someone put it to me very well. I think that ultimately Jeremy Corbyn cares more about Latin American trade unions than the European Union. It's not that interested, and it's not one of the sort of elite issues in sort of Corbyn's breast that really animate him, and therefore he would rather just not get involved, and therefore that's why you've ended up with this competition between John McDonnell, who desperately wants to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, recognises that being a radical left-wing government is going to be difficult when there's a smouldering crater where the Exchequer used to be because you've had a no-deal Brexit, versus, you know, more ideological Eurosceptic left that thinks you can't do proper left-wing politics within the EU.
And that was always the dynamic between the two of them, actually, when they were backbenchers, as sort of a little twosome that they had for years and years, is that Jeremy Corbyn would do foreign affairs and he wouldn't really think about the economy, and John McDonnell would do the economy, and, you know, he wouldn't interfere with Jeremy's sort of, you know, love of Venezuela and so on. And it's a bit more difficult to do that when you're running an entire party rather than just a little duo.
So how does the arrival of Boris Johnson impact the stability of Jeremy Corbyn's time as leader? You were talking about the attempts people have been making at prizing Seamus Milne out of the leader's office. Is that a sign of real intent, or is sometimes one thinks when people go for the advisor, not the leader, it's actually because they haven't got the guts to or the power to go for the leader themselves? Which is it? Is he unstable at the moment? Will Boris Johnson arriving in number 10, how will that affect the story of Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, one of the reasons the Conservatives are about to elect Boris Johnson is that they think that he would easily sweep away Jeremy Corbyn in the way that Theresa May wasn't able to do in 2017. And that has agitated some Labour MPs who think, well, it would be really smart if we managed to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn now and installed someone else who enjoyed a honeymoon period, who would be able to actually do some damage to Boris Johnson at the very least if there were an election in the next few months. And so there is greater instability around Jeremy Corbyn as a result of both the threat of Boris Johnson and actually the suspicions in amongst his backbenchers that someone could do a bit better. And that's leading to an increase in plotting. But I think a lot of people are looking for the wrong signs of a move against Jeremy Corbyn. There's not going to be a coup. There's not going to be someone who challenges him. That's all been tried. Mass resignations from the shadow cabinet, MPs walking out to form another party.
What should we look out for? What are the tactics?
There's a sort of destabilisation strategy underway where the hope is that Corbyn will go of his own accord. It'll be impossible for him to carry on leading the party because not only are MPs difficult to lead and constantly complaining, not only are peers taking out adverts in the Times to complain about his handling of anti-Semitism, but the shadow cabinet is also in uproar and unmanageable. And at that point he says, I've had enough. Because in the 2016 attempted coup, which failed, there was this pause when Corbyn was actually quite close to saying, I've had enough.
There was a moment, wasn't there?
There was, but unfortunately for
John stiffened his resolve.
Unfortunately for the plotters, they paused, and as Rafael says, John McDonnell says, no, you've got to keep going. And that pause allowed Jeremy Corbyn to regroup and to sort of become inspired once again. Now, they're hoping that at some point Corbyn and perhaps his family will say, no, we've just had enough of this, we're going to walk away.
Yeah, I mean, John is key on that.
John McDonnell.
John McDonnell is key on that. And I don't know why I call him John, he's not a friend of mine. But
It hasn't become like Boris, the household name.
Not yet, anyway.
John, that instantly recognisable name.
Ken Livingstone.
No one else has it.
But no, I mean, on the Boris Johnson thing, the sort of counter view that you hear from within the Labour Party to the one Isabel put forward is that actually Johnson is such a marmitey figure. And because he's so associated with the Vote Leave campaign, and as I said, there is this sense, I think slightly wrongly, but it's around that he is basically a British Trump figure, that is the one thing that could reassemble the 26 to 17 Labour coalition and force some of the people who are currently voting Lib Dems to go, oh, well, look, if it really comes down to a choice of having to endorse Boris Johnson, no deal, all of that supported, it's kind of Farageism with a blonde wig on it. Okay, I'm going to have to vote Labour. That, they think, might be the one thing that could compensate for a little bit, at least, for how unpopular with a lot of voters Jeremy Corbyn has become. I think one of the things that's changed is even at someone like John McDonnell starting to think, actually Corbyn, who used to be this brilliant sort of force for, as it were, sort of laundering quite radical hard left politics with a sort of cuddly image, and he was this sort of socialist Santa who no one really believed that he was this sort of terrorist loving Hamas friend sort of thing that his enemies described him as. That was really helping sort of open up Corbynism to a lot of people. Now that seems to have gone. There's no more of the kind of Glastonbury love. It has sort of reduced now to and Corbyn himself has become a little bit more toxic, even for people who were quite liking it a year or two ago. And so at what point do actual Corbynites start to think, Jeremy Corbyn's now part of the problem, not part of the solution? And what you used to have a large group of people in the middle of the Labour membership who were sort of idealists but not ideologues. And they liked a bit of socialism. They just thought, why can't you just do good, honest social justice things? And when the sort of, for want of a better word, Blairites attacked Corbyn as this very extreme Soviet Union loving terrorist supporting all the rest of it, anti-Semite and other things, they didn't recognise that in themselves and they didn't recognise it in him, so they just rallied around him. Now the Brexit thing has slightly changed that, because that same group of people, the sort of soft left idealists who are very pro-Corbyn, are also very, very Remain. And so now they're starting to feel a bit betrayed. They're really let down by Jeremy. Not yet at the point where they're hostile to him, but they're let down. And so what you've got sort of Tom Watson and John McDonnell watching their kind of Corbyn loveometer, watching the needle going, has that now gone into a place where actually we can move against him if you're Tom, or if you're John, where I need to persuade him to actually step aside. And that's what literally right at this moment, those two people are currently monitoring their Corbyn love-ometer going, is this now the danger time for him?
And who makes their love-ometer ping high in terms of alternatives? That's the great challenge, isn't it? Both of you throw up your hands.
Well, I mean, there is talk, not just amongst the left of the party, but amongst those who do not like Corbyn, that firstly anyone but Corbyn would be better, although they then go, oh, but John McDonnell, he's got similar views. But actually there are shadow cabinet members who are palatable to the sort of moderate, soft left wing of the party, whatever you want to call them, such as Angela Rayner or Rebecca Long-Bailey, who both have much better interpersonal skills than Jeremy Corbyn. Actually, the Tories really enjoyed working with Rebecca Long-Bailey in the Brexit talk, so they thought she was really nice, which I'm not sure whether that's going to help her standing in the party. But those two figures they see as being less factional, people who are sort of on the very left of the Labour Party for different reasons to Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, less for machine reasons and more for sort of emotional reasons, and they feel they can work with that.
Yeah, more. And I think there's a sense that a lot of the domestic radical left stuff, a lot of sort of domestic McDonnellism would be okay for a vast majority of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Certainly the manifesto, the 2017 manifesto, what people want to get rid of is what they call the sort of the slightly sort of what they call the sort of the nutty foreign policy stuff plus the anti-Semitism. So they're sort of taking Kremlin lines to take on Skripal and all that sort of stuff. That if you could sort of excise that, then people would accept quite a radical left domestic agenda quite comfortably.
So if Boris Johnson were coming in and thinking, as there's speculation around in the last 24 hours, that he's thinking of an election maybe in the first half of next year, how long has he got before Jeremy Corbyn is replaced? Because you could understand his rationale, because he doesn't rate Jeremy Corbyn as being, this is the moment to try and make sure that I have a contest against him and I might just have a chance. How long do you think Jeremy Corbyn has got if Boris Johnson has got us out on no deal end of October and is looking at an election spring, say, next year?
I just think, how do you do an election in spring when you've done a no deal? Because
it could be very bumpy.
Exactly,
yeah.
Immediately after a no deal.
First
of all, the first thing you're doing is trying to negotiate a deal, but from your knees, as opposed to sitting around a table. So that's not going to be much fun. You've lost all your fiscal headroom. If you've had to, let's say you've had to prorogue Parliament to do it, you're in a constitutional crisis, and then you're going to have to bring back Parliament, do the sort of retrospective legislation to try and manage this no deal that you've done, at which point immediately every kind of amendment starts getting shoveled on. The thought that he's going to do no deal and then by March be in a position to go, right, there's a general election.
But the other thing, of course, with that problem, with that election plan that gets talked about, is you'll have done no deal, you'll have done Brexit. So the voters tend not to give you congratulatory re-elections. They tend to move on to another agenda, and it's hard to predict what it is. Do you think there are big problems with that strategy, if it is the strategy?
I mean, I think there's a problem for both parties, really, in remembering that there is a domestic agenda that voters are interested in, and Theresa May certainly didn't manage to deliver a domestic agenda. We've seen the past sort of month of her pulling things out of her sock drawer, saying, here's part of my legacy, here's a random announcement, hoping that people will have something to remember her for other than just not delivering Brexit. And when you go to Boris Johnson's camp and ask them questions about, for instance, the domestic abuse bill, which was introduced to the Commons yesterday, they just don't come back to you because they don't really want to think about domestic policies at the moment. And that's an issue, as you say, because voters don't just want to think about Brexit. They're interested in what's happening in their lives, in their schools, in hospitals and so on. And neither party is really in a place to talk about it.
Yeah, well, certainly Labour would take that scenario if they could be guaranteed that Brexit would no longer be the number one issue on the ballot paper. There are a lot of Labour strategists who think that benefits the opposition, who can say, well, look at the state of our schools, hospitals, and even a lot of people in the Conservative Party, the sort of more thoughtful wing of the Conservative Party that isn't obsessed with Brexit, worrying that actually on a lot of issues the pendulum really has just swung left, and the idea that this sort of as it were, a sort of neo-Thatcherite argument that you just set people free and off they go, and you just cut taxes, and a rising tide raises all the ships, just feels terribly out of date. And people want security, they want investment in their public services, and actually they're open to quite radical redistribution, just saying, you know what, there's a bunch of people who've got plenty, take some of it off them and give it to everyone else. And that supports a domestic Corbynite agenda. I think there's more appetite for that, sort of separate to the character of Jeremy Corbyn, than a lot of Conservatives who are backing Boris Johnson either realise or dare to admit.
How long do you think Boris Johnson's premiership will last, Isabel? I know that's an incredibly tough question, but do you have this feeling in your mind that it's a thing of impermanence that might not be there that long?
I mean, there's certainly a lot of talk amongst Tory MPs about this, but I can't quite see that there would be that many Tory MPs who would really be prepared to vote against, for instance, the government in a no confidence vote, because that's the end of them as Tory MPs. Then you move on to internal party dynamics. You know, would they get rid of him after Brexit, or if there's another sort of horrendous Brexit route? I don't think things are going to be very stable, and you could see that Boris Johnson was thinking a lot about that in the Sun debate on Monday, as was Jeremy Hunt. Actually, they were trying to be really chummy. Jeremy Hunt actually rescued Boris Johnson from questions about his private life when Johnson was being asked who would be living with him in number 10. Hunt just waded in to sort of go off on a tangent saying he'd be living with me, he'd be in number 11 and I'd be in number 10, and you know the question disappeared. And the two men were clearly thinking about how to bring the Conservative Party back together.
You don't think he's going to be brought down by a vote of no confidence? That's your hunch, that it just won't happen that way?
Certainly not a vote of no confidence in the government that would then lead to an election. I think if you then start to look at a vote of no confidence within the Conservative Party, possibly.
Some people have talked about deploying the vote of no confidence in the government, getting Tories on side to do that, and then using the 14 days that are allowed to replace the leader.
That mechanism doesn't work, though. I mean, that's something that whips and former whips have been pointing out to their colleagues isn't actually possible. And
it's interesting they talk about it, isn't
yes,
it? Before
is,
the man's even
again,
there.
they haven't actually read the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
And there's a lot of fantasy stuff around that 14-day period. Another one is this idea that somehow you could bring down the government, but you don't get an election because somehow in that 14 days, David Lidington and Hilary Benn and Yvette Cooper and Joe Swinson all get together and form a magical government of national unity to do whatever it is the person fantasising about this thing wants them to do. I mean, I'd slightly agree with Isabel. I think, when you're looking for a Conservative MP, actually when the bullet's in the chamber and you're looking down the barrel of bringing down the government, possibly then a general election and Jeremy Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, I think a lot of them would chicken out of that.
Yeah. So he could be there quite a while.
Well, my hunch actually, is, this is such a hostage to fortune, is that, we could just in sort of 3-4 years' time just be going, we still seem to have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister.
Just like we did with Theresa May after the 2017 election.
And one of the reasons I think that is one of the sort of simplest but shrewdest things a long-time observer of British politics and practitioner, who I won't name, said about Boris Johnson is that if you look at his career, always, from the beginning, the pattern has always been people saying there's absolutely no way he can do that, followed by him doing it.
Yeah.
And it's true. And, right from becoming Mayor of London, which was a Labour city, to somehow getting back into Parliament when he needed a by-election.
On that basis, he's going to get a deal
Prime Minister
with the EU.
I wouldn't necessarily
rule
it out.
Right.
On the kind of lipstick and the pig scenario, I wouldn't necessarily rule that out.
You wrote a terrific book, Isabel, about MPs and what makes them tick and what different types of MPs and the rest of it. Boris Johnson is as you said in the book, is a very unlikely, unusual type of MP, the performer MP, the comedian MP and the rest of it. Is he too thin-skinned to cope with the pressures at the top, or do you think he's got the right makeup? How will that pan out?
He did go through a very thin-skinned phase where he was apparently reading the comments about him under articles, which, I mean, I haven't done that for about 6 years. So that was an insight into where he was in terms of his self-esteem. But that was a couple of years ago. I would say one thing about him is that he is a real delegator in a way that Theresa May has never managed to do. She, in the Home Office, basically was in charge of everything and often didn't invite the ministers responsible to the meetings where they were discussing those policies. And she tried to replicate that in number 10, which is one of the reasons why we haven't had any domestic policy come out of this government for 3 years. Whereas Boris Johnson is very good at finding good people to do the job for him. He was good at that as an editor, actually. He was good at that in City Hall as well. And so I think you will see ministers probably quite enjoying working with him, in the sense that he's much more likely to say, okay, I trust you, go off and do this thing. Whereas Theresa May would say, if you want to do this thing, you're going to have to spend 6 months writing to me and you might get a reply.
Yeah, I think the downside to that, though, is you will then have two ministers wanting to do things that conflicts with one another, and he won't be able to, he'll see them in sequence, or he'll see them in sequence and say to one, yes, brilliant, absolutely, do that, go and spend all the money. And then the Chancellor will come in and he'll say, no, obviously you can't give the money for that, no, that's a terrible idea. And there'll be complete gridlock. But also, I just think that there's a lot of people saying, oh, look at the way he ran City Hall. Well, the thing about City Hall is, you can basically just disappear off the grid. If something bad is happening and it's not really happening in London, or it's not necessarily, you don't have executive responsibility for it, you just do the submarine thing and just disappear for a bit. You can't do that when you're a Prime Minister. And I think they will be very, very surprised at how relentless, remorseless the workload is, how much detail there is to get across, and how much of it does actually end up on the Prime Minister's desk. And I think I think he's really unprepared for that.
Yeah, and he struggled with that in the Foreign Office, and the Foreign Office is not, for instance, the Home Office, which is constantly screwing up people's immigration cases. Actually, he's got a lot to learn about the difference between City Hall, which has got a lot of strategic role, and the Downing Street, which has got a lot of delivery and oversight.
Yeah, and look at two things that happened on Theresa May's watch that you just couldn't have foreseen. Grenfell, Skripal, one very, very different issues. Whatever you've planned for your grid that week, it's off, and you've got to focus on this very, very difficult thing where if you get the politics of it wrong, there are very, very serious consequences. I think he could, going slightly contradicting myself, he could really quickly come a cropper on that sort of stuff.
Yeah, he could put people's backs up, actually in a way that David Cameron used to as well, because Cameron would get rattled in the chamber and would say things that he hadn't intended to say, like, calm down, dear. He used to go very pink about 5 minutes into PMQ.
And you saw Boris Johnson getting quite rattled by Andrew Neil last week.
Exactly. And he was, Andrew Neil is a terrifying questioner, but he's not 650 MPs all roaring and making strange mooing sounds, and as they do in Prime Minister's questions. And I wonder whether there will be some PMQ sessions, particularly given a lot of opposition politicians such as Ian Blackford want to be very personal about Boris Johnson.
It was never his happiest place, was it?
It's true, he's actually quite a rubbish parliamentarian. For someone who sort of came through the Eton, Oxford tradition, all those things, he's basically lived off the same institutional diet of, and been in the same sorts of buildings his whole life, absolutely a product of that system. He's not, he's weirdly a bit useless actually in the chamber.
So is Jeremy Corbyn though, so I suppose he'll get an easy ride there.
I'm not sure about that. I can imagine actually Jeremy Corbyn's style of just not wanting to play not playing to the sort of verbal
varsity debating style and the rest of it.
Actually, and Johnson not being very spontaneous on that stuff, him wanting to joke his way out of it, looking very bad, actually.
The chemistry might help Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah, a little bit.
Very quick last one. We're about to have Theresa May's penultimate Prime Minister's questions. How will history judge her, Isabel?
I think it will be kinder to her in the long run over Brexit, because she tries to say this herself quite a lot. We may well see it at PMQs again, her having a go at, everyone basically for blocking her deal and for making it harder for Britain to leave. And I think she was someone who tried to deal with so many conflicting groups that I think history will be a little bit kinder to her than we are being at the moment. But in terms of what she's remembered for, she will be remembered really for a failure. Yeah, she had one job and she didn't do it, I think. And so in terms of the temperament and the character, the sort of victimisation by her party and others, that colours it in slightly with pathos. But was she a successful Prime Minister? Has she been a successful Prime Minister? Very obviously not, Well, you both had one job to talk me through everything. You've done it wonderfully. I'm very, very grateful. We managed to touch on John McDonnell's love-ometer and Theresa May's sock drawer. So really comprehensive stuff. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts.